Hello, everyone, and welcome to AP US History for Winners with your teacher, Mr. Johnson. Last time, we talked about how the civil rights movement expanded to include other groups, and today we are talking about the youth culture of the 1960s and issues relating to the environment and natural resources from 1968 to 1980. So, if you are ready, let's begin. First, we are going to talk about how people on the left are rejecting mainstream liberal policies. And just to review these terms, if we're thinking in terms of general government politics, when people say left, they are usually referring to liberals. They're referring to people in this time period in the Democratic Party. And when they say right, they're referring to conservatives, and they're referring to people in the Republican Party. Now, so with that said, you would think that liberals on the left would be in support of the Democratic Party. But in the 1960s, we see liberals on the left thinking that basically the government and the Democratic Party, who was in power with LBJ and JFK, basically the Democratic Party is not going far enough to create the change that they wanted to see. And some of the change that they wanted to see was about the Vietnam War. So there's this group that we should be familiar with, Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, and they're often brought up on AP exams, this group of people. And it's basically a student protest movement. And like I said, they're very against the Cold War, the war between communism and capitalism, this quasi-war between the United States and the Soviet Union. And they're very against the Vietnam War, which had been going on for almost, for a long time at this point. Okay. And they're a part of this broader counterculture movement. And the counterculture movement is basically when people, especially young people, are trying to act out against mainstream culture in older generations. And this counterculture movement, these liberals on the far left, they are thinking they want the Vietnam War to end. They often want to decriminalize drug use, okay? And they want to make it so that there's equal treatment for all. Continuing this on this idea, I wanted to spell it out for you at the top. That's an important concept, so we should bold or highlight that the left thought that the Democrats were not doing enough to help society. The far left, I should say, right? So people on the far left think that the mainstream Democratic Party needs to be doing more. And a good example for this is the 1968 Democratic Convention, which basically shows how the Democratic Party was disjointed. And a Democratic Convention is something that's held every 4 years, and it basically is where the Democrats nominate a person to run for president, and Republicans have the same kind of convention, right? And in 1968, what's weird though is that LBJ, who was the incumbent president, he decided not to run. He had another term that he could have run for, and he decided not to. So it leaves this open seat, and it basically creates this convention where there normally would have just nominated LBJ, but he doesn't want it, and it creates this convention that erupts into protests. We see this group called the Yippies. Okay, that's the Youth International Party, and they're a radical left-wing party. For example, they tried to nominate a pig for president. Okay, that's just to show how much distaste they had for the Democratic Party and what they were doing. Okay, and there's a lot of students involved here and protests, and essentially because of all the protests, they do nominate Hubert Humphrey to run for president for the Democrats, but because of all these protests, it becomes goes out in the mainstream media. Richard Nixon, the Republican, wins in 1968. So the Democrats had a long run of winning presidential elections, and they had been dominating politics for a while. But because of this basically disjointedness in the Democratic Party between people on the far left and on the middle left, Richard Nixon, Republican, wins in 1968. And also, we should be aware of some liberal terrorist groups that are around in the 1960s. One of them is called the Weather Underground, and another is called the Symbionese Liberation Army. And the SLA, the Symbionese Liberation Army, they were very against the Vietnam War. They were very against the U.S. government, but to such an extent that they were willing to bomb government buildings. They were willing to try to hijack banks and bomb banks, okay, hold people hostage. That's kind of the things that these terrorist groups were willing to do. Okay, so moving on to talk more about 1960s culture, there is this more mainstream, still on the fringe, but more mainstream idea of general counterculture. Okay. And the counterculture movement is usually thought of as young people in the 1960s and 70s that are rejecting materialism, rejecting the old way of doing things, of valuing material goods. And you can think of this, if you think of the hippies, right? You can think of this as like sex, drugs, and rock and roll was often how they were characterized at the time. And it's really important to note, so bold this, that the counterculture movement is often defined by this generation gap, right? So this old versus young, the older generation is not happy seeing how the young generation is acting. The young generation doesn't think the old generation is doing what they should be doing, right? They both are clashing, okay? So old versus young, right? Like buzz cuts versus long hair, wearing suits to work versus wearing jeans, getting married right out of high school versus this idea of sexual rebellion, okay? Living in the suburbs versus moving to the cities, all right? So the old generation often responds to the young generation with this like kind of no shoes, no shirts, no service attitude, right? Like there are very strict rules that people need to follow. If you're not following those rules, then get out. And it's just, again, an example. We should be aware of the culture in the 60s, 70s of this clash that we're seeing between the young and the old generations in this counterculture movement. Okay, so shifting gears a little bit, we want to talk about how the United States is concerned with what's going on in the Middle East. So this is a little bit of foreign policy, so shift your mindset for a little bit. We're kind of putting culture to the side for right now. So the Cold War is raging on, as we've been talking about, kind of all unit. And today we're going to talk specifically about what's going on in the Middle East. The Middle East is a specific area that is of concern for Dwight Eisenhower, pictured on the left, okay? And one of the big reasons why the Middle East is such a concern is because of the amount of oil that is present in the Middle East and how close it is to the Soviet Union. And the US tries to ally with a couple of countries, Turkey and Israel. And they try to stake their claim with those countries and basically try to push them to be their allies in the region and try to further their ideas. And I think we've talked about this next bullet before, but it's good to review because it's a little bit of a complicated idea. The president of Egypt, who's named Nasser, he had nationalized the Suez Canal in Egypt. And the Suez Canal was this narrow area where ships could pass through, okay? And basically what the president of Egypt did, he said, well, it's going to now belong all to Egypt, and Egypt's going to get to decide who goes through this Suez Canal. And the British, the French, and Israel, they end up going to war with Egypt to try to get it back. And we talked about this before. You might think that the United States would help out Britain, France, Israel, right? But they do not. They actually try to get those countries to stop, to try to get Egypt on America's side, to try to get another ally in the Middle East. But Nasser, the president of Egypt, ends up turning to the Soviets to help build the Aswan Dam and basically to try to get more support. And so we can see how there is this competition between the Soviet Union and the United States over who has more access and more allies in the Middle East. Now, we talked about Dwight Eisenhower a little bit. He is someone who thought that the Middle East was a very important region for U.S. foreign policy, and he comes up with what's called the Eisenhower Doctrine. We've heard of all these doctrines before. This one is similar to the Truman Doctrine, but it's specific to the Middle East. Essentially, Eisenhower was willing to support less than nice governments as long as they favored American ideas about capitalism and they were against the Soviet Union, specifically in the Middle East. And for example, he does this with countries like Jordan, Lebanon, and Iran during this time period. All right, shifting gears again. The rest of the slides today are going to be about the environmental movement. All right. So the first thing we're going to talk about is a very, very, very important name, a very important person, a very important book. It's pretty life-changing in terms of the environmental movement. And it's this woman named Rachel Carson, and she writes a book called Silent Spring in 1962. And, at this time, pesticides had been becoming more and more widespread, and people had been under the impression that pesticides were these wonderful chemicals that are killing bugs and increasing the amount of crops people can produce. However, what Rachel Carson discovers, and she writes about it in this book, Silent Spring, is that there's an immense amount of damage caused by this pesticide. It's called DDT. And this damage is having huge effects on the food chain, okay? And it's having huge effects in the suburbs and the bird population, right? Just because you kill insects, it's going to affect the whole food chain, right? The whole animal kingdom. So this book becomes very widespread, very influential, and it sparks the environmental movement to really take off. And it sparks a lot of pro-environmental laws. And we'll see in the 60s and 70s a big trend towards creating more environmental laws in many ways. For example, President LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, pushes through a law called the Wilderness Preservation Act in 1964. That law blocks development in federal land. So if the government owned the land, people couldn't just develop it without getting permission. The Air and Water Quality Acts were passed in 1965, and those were laws about interstate pollution and controlling the quality of our air air, and water. There's a group that comes about in the 60s called the Sierra Club in 1966, and they worked to lobby to try to block dams that would have flooded the Grand Canyon and a number of other environmental issues they worked to try to stop. Continuing on with the environmental movement, one thing that we had talked about previously was the OPEC oil embargo in 1973. Now, OPEC is a group of countries in the Middle East who kind of negotiated together, and they decided to stop selling oil to the United States because of some of the U.S. foreign policy. And we had talked previously about how that relates to foreign policy, but now we're going to talk about how it relates to the environmental movement. When people are not able to get gasoline and oil, right, for their cars, this is going to lead to people conserving more and more oil and trying to find ways to try to limit the amount of oil they're using, right? So this starts ideas like the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit in a lot of places, okay? Pushes to make more fuel-efficient cars. The idea of Earth Day gets started, okay? Teaching environmental awareness in schools, the push to get people to recycle, the push for renewable energies like solar, wind, and geothermal power. All that stuff comes about in the 1970s and late 60s, and one route you can think of it as is because of this OPEC oil embargo, people have to find other ways to fuel their cars and their homes. All right, continuing on with the environmental movement, there is a couple of disasters that kind of happen that cause more people to be more aware. There's a lot of oil spills that go on in the late 60s, early 70s. And one of the most famous ones is in the Cayuga River in Ohio, which basically, as you can see a picture on the left, it gets set on fire. Okay, this is a very famous event because the oil stays on top of the water and it can catch on fire, right? So people are seeing these pictures in the news of a river in Lake Erie being caught on fire, right? This river is right near Lake Erie. And this is causing people to become more aware of the environmental impact of using so much oil and not having enough regulation. And so what happens under Nixon, the president after LBJ, is we see more pro-environmental laws. The EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, comes about in 1970. The Clean Air Act, the Water Pollution Act, the Endangered Species Act. These are all examples of laws of Richard Nixon and the government during the late 60s, and this is the early 70s, trying to get anti-pollution laws on the books to target corporations. And then next president after Nixon, Jimmy Carter, in 1977, he creates the Energy Department. So now there's a whole department in the government that's in charge of thinking about U.S. energy policy and conservation. And again, this is to show you, I wouldn't say you have to memorize all of these, but I would have one or two laws memorized about the environmental movement, a person, something like that, so that you can use as evidence for how the environmental movement starts in case you get a DBQ or an LEQ or SAQ, right, about the environmental movement. Okay, last thing we're going to talk about today is kind of the conservative response and the corporate response to the environmental reform. And many conservatives are opposed to environmental reform in this time period, and because they think of it as government overreach, that the government is getting too big and that they're trying to control what businesses can and cannot do. And corporations and businesses are going to be against the environmental movement because it's going to cost them more money if they need to be careful about how they're disposing of their waste, right? It costs more money to be safe with that, all right? And a couple other accidents and issues that happen that, again, get people to be more aware, and it's an example of issues at the time. One of them is called the 3 Mile Island accident in 1979. And this was a nuclear power plant, and there's an accident at a nuclear power plant. This is a huge issue, right? And what this starts is a big anti-nuclear movement that gets started. And a lot of people do not want nuclear power plants built anywhere near their backyard. Sometimes you hear it called NIMBY, not in my backyard. They don't want any of these nuclear power plants built near their homes because of the risk of a nuclear meltdown of the power plants. And then the last event we'll talk about is Love Canal. And this was basically an environmental wake-up call for a lot of people. There was businesses and corporations that were dumping chemical waste into the local watershed area in this area called Love Canal, okay? And it led to a ton of health issues for the people who are living there, but the government was slow to react, slow to do much about it, and so we saw massive protests. They even ended up kidnapping a federal official during these protests. So this is, again, to show you how angry people are about the destruction of the environment and the impact that it's having on their lives. And Jimmy Carter ends up giving federal emergency aid and helps the inhabitants of this area evacuate. But again, it just goes to show about the environmental issues are coming to a head in the late 60s, early to mid 70s. All right, that is it for our notes on the youth culture of the 1960s and the environment and natural resources from 1968 to 1980. I know that was a lot, so let's kind of break it down, make sure we can synthesize the information. Number one, describe the youth culture of the 1960s and try to be specific about one aspect of youth culture. Number two, how did the US interact with the Middle East during this time and be specific about one way or one story of how the US interacted in the Middle East. And number three, how and why did environmental policies change from 1968 to 1980 and be specific about a law, a person, or a way that they changed. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you next time.